Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Judy and I love travel, history, and finding out what makes people tick. Today we're visiting Arles, which grew from a rather minor Celtic stronghold into a substantial and respectable Roman city, then became an important medieval Christian stronghold, and much more recently formed a part of Vincent van Gogh's travels in Provence. Walk with me, the Armchair Traveler, to visit this lovely city and discover the clues that have been left behind. Although it looms large in the history of the Roman Empire and in southern France, the area the Romans called Provence is actually fairly small, and today, as in the days of the legionaries, quite well connected by various transportation routes. In 1970, I came here more or less by accident. I made my day trips from here. This time, my Provençal home bases were in Nîmes and Avignon. I made the trip from Avignon by train. By a straight line, the two cities are less than 17 miles apart, but it's a little further by train, although still less than half an hour, station to station, and an easy day trip for anyone not inclined to spend the night. In the Roman era, Arles would become one of Gaul's most important cities. The city didn't start out that way. This was not some destiny handed down from on high. It came from actions by the Romans and the local people. When the Romans arrived in Arles, modern Arles, in the 2nd century BCE, it was just a small settlement of people who called themselves the Seluvi. They were a Ligurian Gallic tribe. The exact population size at that time is uncertain, but estimates suggest around a few thousand people in the area at most. Modern archaeologists have uncovered some recent evidence that suggests that there was a Ligurian oppidum, or fortification, likely located on the Montagne de Cord, which just means a hill, and less than 2 miles from the modern-day Rhone River, on high ground. These oppida were common among Celtic and Ligurian tribes. They served as political, economic, and defensive centers. The one near today's Arles would have had wooden and stone fortifications, storage areas, and homes made of timber or brick. After the Roman conquest of southern Gaul, after the Roman conquest of the area, this particular oppidum was probably abandoned in favor of an area closer to the river. Over the next 80 years, the local people became Romanized. They learned a simplified form of Latin in order to do business with the legionaries. The legionaries figured they'd be in the area for the long haul, and they always had a plan, and the plan started with building infrastructure. The Via Domitia was the first Roman road built in Gaul, and it linked Italy and Hispania through Gallia, across what is now southern France, and all the way to Rome. The route crossed the Rhone River at Beauclair, less than 10 miles north of Arles. The legionaries also put in a canal designed to get past the swamps and unreliable river flow of the Rhone River and make shipping products downstream practical. Growth and acculturation of the local people proceeded at a reasonable rate after that. Roman occupation came with demands, but also had potential benefits. The demands involved the local people accepting their status as a province, paying their taxes, serving in the military. The benefits included Roman-built infrastructure. A lot of things happened pretty much all at once the legionaries secured an area. They began putting in what we might think of as domestic infrastructure, things like public baths, public fountains, a sanitary system, and temples. And they began putting in a transportation network. This map shows you some of the major Roman roads. There were several in the area. The first of these was the Via Domitia, which we've met before. Construction began in 118 BCE and proceeded quite quickly. The road ran northward from Spain through what would become Narbonne, Colonia Narbo Martius on this map, then swung east to just north of Arles. A separate route, labeled the Via Agrippa Lyon-Arles on this map, swung north to the modern city of Vienne and from there on to Lyon. It crossed the Rhone River at a town called Beauclair near modern-day Tarascon. This was one of the narrowest and most strategic crossing points in the southern part of the Rhone River. The Romans likely built a wooden bridge or used ferries to cross. The route to the Mediterranean might seem to be easier, just use the river. This area, from just north of Arles, where the Rhone splits into 2 branches, to the sea amounted to an enormous shifting tidal delta. River traffic southward was difficult and uncertain. The Romans tackled that not with a road, but with a canal. Provence was the frontier. The Romans were aware of a potential invasion force of Germanic peoples headed toward Gaul from the north. Word of these invasions or migrations might have traveled more slowly then than now, but word still spread. Once an area was conquered, part of its job was to protect the homeland by short-stopping potential invaders before they could make it to peninsular Italy. The Romans didn't always succeed. One of their enormous losses was at the Battle of Arles near modern-day Orange, France in 105 BCE. Afterward, a Roman general named Gaius Marius was given command and put in charge of both strengthening the military capability. One of his enormous insights was that he needed to be able to move his forces and supplies faster inland from the Mediterranean to the Roman town of Arles. He ordered construction of a canal, which got its name from him. The goal was connecting the Rhone River to the Mediterranean Sea to allow him to move his men and material more efficiently. We know a bit about the canal and more about Marius. You can read about one of his lesser innovations, a kind of Roman legionary backpack, in my WordPress blog. I'll put the address in the description box below. The endpoints of the Fossa Mariana were at or near Arles, already a major Roman town and port on the Rhone, and somewhere close to the area of Port de Bouc, which is located near modern-day Bouc-Bel-Air. I've marked the endpoints on the map for you, as well as marking today's course of the Rhone River with a purple arrow. The straight line distance here is about 25 miles, although the actual route was almost certainly considerably longer. The sources I consulted suggest that this canal was actually built fairly quickly, with estimates ranging from 3 to 4 years to finish it. That's speed, and keep in mind on average it takes Americans with bulldozers 1 or 2 years to complete the planning and building of each mile of an interstate highway. Tells me they must have followed the path of an existing tributary of the Rhone, which would have cut back on construction time and effort at least a bit. The canal made the journey time for trips traveling between Rhone and the Mediterranean drop sharply, making it faster and easier for Marius to move his men and equipment. Only later, as the area was secured, did it convert to more of a civilian asset. In the long run, however, the canal failed and has disappeared. The best guess is that it, like the river's beds it was probably built in, silted up. Over 80 years, the local citizenry became Romanized. Things were going pretty well, and they were about to get much better. Between 49 and 45 BCE, Julius Caesar fought a civil war with the Roman Republic. Massalia, today's Marseille, had been a Greek colony that long ago had thrown in its lot with Rome as an ally. The question was, which Rome? Massalia, the city, resisted fiercely, relying on its formidable defenses and fleet, and sided with Pompey. Arles sided with Caesar. Caesar's army besieged the city in 49 BCE, after which Massalia was forced to surrender. Caesar refounded Arles in 46 BCE as a colonia, or colony, and settled veterans from his legionaries there. Those veterans and their families expected all the amenities that any Roman citizen depended upon, things like a recognizable street layout, an aqueduct to bring in fresh water, flour mills, fountains, baths, drainage, temples, streets, defensive walls. All of it went up mostly in the 2nd and 3rd century AD. Roman civilization was nothing if not adaptable. Once infamous for consistent, insistent, and dreadful persecution of Christians, whom they viewed as a threat, Constantine the Great read the room and converted to Christianity and put an end to the persecutions. At that point, Arles became a major Christian center. Whether this was a profound religious experience or an expression of Roman practicality on his part is still up for debate. Perhaps both were involved. Roman Arles measured perhaps 100 acres in size and was gradually enclosed by protective city walls. This drawing shows you the enclosed area, looking to the south rather than putting north at the top of the map. These still imposing walls went up as the Roman Empire was beginning to decline, but the walls were expanded and strengthened in the Middle Ages, especially during the 12th and 13th century. Some sections of the wall were later dismantled in the 19th century to allow for the city to grow, but significant chunks of them, including this section, are still visible. An amphitheater or an arena was always an important symbol and part of the social status of any Roman city. Arles gained colonial status during the Roman Civil War, and infrastructure soon followed. This amphitheater is two-tiered and is probably the most prominent tourist attraction in the city. It was built in 90 AD and held over 20,000 spectators. Nowadays it draws smaller crowds for bullfighting, as well as plays and concerts in the summer. With the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century, however, the amphitheater became a shelter for the population and was actually transformed into a fortress with 4 large towers, 3 of which survived. This was a sturdy building that played home to as many as 200 homes, becoming a real town on the inside with a public square in the center of the arena, 2 chapels, one in the center and one on the edge of the West Tower. Among other things, many of the openings to the original building were bricked or blocked in to make it more defensible, and some of that medieval handiwork survives, as you can see in this photograph. This new residential role continued until the 19th century. In 1825, it gained National Historical Monument status. The next year, expropriation of those homeowners inside the walls began, and ended by 1830, when the first event was organized in the area, a race to the bulls to celebrate the taking of Algiers. The Roman Theatre in Arles is one of the most notable ancient theaters in southern Gaul and a key Roman monument left over in the city. It was built during the 1st century BCE, likely during the time of Julius Caesar or shortly thereafter. In its prime, it held around 10,000 guests, a large crowd for any time. This view from Google Earth clearly shows you its semicircular shape, complete with an enormous bite taken out of the tiers where stone might have been repurposed for other buildings. This second image gives you the patron's view of the stage. The theater had a backdrop with decorative columns and walls, which mostly have not survived. This somewhat theoretical drawing shows what it might have looked like in its prime, although I think this model might be a little more clear. The seating area itself was arranged in tiers, with the best seats for the elite and the higher status individuals positioned closer to the stage. You can see the surviving tiered city and the stage in my photograph. The theater hosted dramatic performances, comedies, musical performances, public speeches, and even poetry readings. Theater time for the Romans was typically in the daytime. One item caught my eye. This theater is sited so the audience faced due west. Greek-style theaters, after which the Romans were generally patterned, often had the audience facing south or southeast on the theory that the setting sun wouldn't blind them, and when the topography allowed it, dug into a slope or a hillside to cut down on the digging required and to provide support for the seating tiers. This time the audience faces due west. There are all kinds of speculations about why. No sun-oriented explanation makes much sense to me, so here's my take. Topography outweighed the light. We'll see in a few minutes that Roman engineers didn't have a nice flat area to work with here in downtown Arles. The theater is built on a sloping area and facing west because that was probably the best way to utilize the natural terrain. The stage itself sits at about 52.5 feet above sea level. I know this because Google Earth will tell me. And the seating tiers were dug into a small hill where the modern parking lot is and sit at about 66 feet. Unfortunately, by the Middle Ages, the theater began to fall into disrepair. It was later used for medieval fortifications and housing, much as was the arena, and much of the original structure was either buried or repurposed. The stone seating area, which formed that semicircular arc, was used to create a fortified wall. The orchestra, the area in front of the stage, and other sections of the theater were repurposed as residential and storage spaces. The tiers were converted into living quarters in some cases, with people building homes inside the theater. This theater has been restored and is still in use today for cultural events, including concerts, theater performances, and even festivals. The Roman necropolis we call Arles today was originally Elysian Fields in Latin. The Arles complex was established in the 1st century BCE during the time of the Roman Republic and remained one of the most famous necropolises or burial grounds in the Western world. It was still well known in the Middle Ages and even makes a bit part appearance somewhere in Dante's Inferno. Roman-era visitors and travelers would have approached the city along the Roman road and would have passed along this line of tombs and mausoleums. Roman cities traditionally forbade burials within the city limits as a sanitary measure. I don't think ordinary souls ended up here. It was used primarily for the burial of Roman citizens, and especially those among the elite and wealthy. The imperial Romans practiced both cremation and inhumation, or burial, but the preference for one over the other changed over time and social class. Cremation was more common in the early Roman period, especially during the Republic. The Romans saw this as a way to release the soul of the deceased, and the ashes were typically placed in urns. They needed to do something with those urns, so wealthy families might have large, elaborate tombs called columbaria, where those urns were stored. Starting in the 2nd century, however, inhumation became more common. The shift was influenced by a variety of factors, including, I think later on, the growing influence of Christianity, which rejected cremation in favor of burial, based on the Christian belief of the resurrection of the body. By the 4th century CE, burial had become the dominant practice in Christian communities, and many cemeteries like this one began to feature sarcophagi and stone tombs for burials. Later on, this was perceived as a pleasant garden. Among the visitors were Vincent van Gogh and his sometime companion, Paul Gauguin. You can see how they viewed the cemetery in these two images. Van Gogh's work is on the left. Arles continued to be an important city after Constantine I, sometimes called Constantine the Great, fought his way to the throne. The city was a military and administrative center for him. Like a king, an emperor needed a palace to house him when he visited, and more importantly, a place for his functionaries, who ran the empire for him, to live and work. Even though Arles wasn't his main military headquarters, Constantine built a grand palace and Roman baths here, showcasing his vision of the city as a kind of mini Rome set in Gaul. Unfortunately, the baths of Constantine are all that remain of this building. The rest of the palace, if there is any of it left, now sits under the modern city. What's in a name? Places don't always correspond to their names. Today, the Place du Forum, marked here with a black arrow, is, I think, a bit north of the area that might have been the original Roman-era Forum, and is more closely associated with medieval and modern developments. Today, this is a lively square that oozes charm and modern life. It is lined with restaurants and boutiques, making it a nice spot for dining and shopping. It's also a great place to just sit, enjoy a coffee, or just rest your feet after walking the city. The Café de la Nuit, which you see here, is a famous landmark on the Place du Forum, thanks mostly to Van Gogh's painting of it. Van Gogh had been living at a different establishment called the Hotel Carol, but had moved out to the Café de la Nuit because, it said, he was looking for a more inspirational and independent living space that better fit his lifestyle. There's more to the story. Van Gogh's relationship with the owner of the hotel was more than just a little strained, especially when it came to his paying his bills. It's possible that Van Gogh's inability to pay for his room at the hotel contributed to his decision to leave, or possibly the owner just threw him out. The Café de la Nuit is also a bit more central and far busier, with a nicer atmosphere, or at least one that he said he craved. It became an important part of his artistic journey here in the city. The cafe was run by a couple named Genoux. Vincent lived there after he left the Hotel Carol. He painted the lady of the house, perhaps hoping for a discount on his bill, shown here looking at some books and perhaps wondering if her guest was ever going to pay up and pick up his tab. The Place de la République, shown here in a Google Earth image, probably sits on top of the site of Arles' Roman Forum and would have been the center of political, commercial, and social life during the Roman period. Over time, the square evolved and branched out and contracted. In the medieval period, more buildings were constructed, laying a new history on top of the Roman foundation. It's still a lively place for both locals and tourists, with cafes, shops, and public spaces, but also has some historical importance. The Baroque building you see here in the square with the red flag is the Hôtel de Ville, or City Hall. It was built between 1673 and 1676 by a French architect named Jules Mansart, with contributions from a local architect. Mansart's name might be familiar to you. He was a prominent French architect, best known for his work under Louis XIV and his contributions to the Baroque style in France. Nothing truly original from the Roman era that was here in those days remains, except this obelisk, which came from someplace else. Unlike most of the obelisks to be seen throughout the former Roman Empire, this one wasn't stolen from Egypt or Asia. It was apparently purpose-carved here or near here out of imported red granite. We think it sat at one end of the former Roman circus or racetrack, possibly as a mile marker. Underneath this area is our next stop. Reach from inside the Hotel de Ville. Downstairs, under the Hotel de Ville, is a large underground gallery called the Cryptoporticus. The Forum was constructed here in the 1st century BCE under the Emperor Augustus. Builders faced a problem. The area here in the city is actually fairly uneven. His builders weren't about to let something like that stop them. They could get around it by excavating the high spots and using the dirt to fill in the low spots. So why would a forum need a basement? The answer lies in the soil in the area. It seems likely to me that long before the Romans arrived, the Rhone River may have run closer to this area, leaving behind a relatively soft and unstable subsoil. There are 3 parallel galleries here, connected by passageways forming a U shape. The main part of the building consists of Roman concrete, a mixture of lime, sand, water, and stone rubble, which was a common Roman building technique for underground structures because it was strong and durable. Limestone blocks were used more sparingly. They were probably quarried in the hills northeast of the city and floated down the river to this site. They would have been used for the arches, vaults, and supporting piers to provide additional strength and some aesthetic appeal. The barrel-vaulted ceiling was built to carry a load. The area even had windows, not glassed in of course, but openings to allow for ventilation and light, making sure the space was functional despite being mostly underground. Like the arena and the theater we visited earlier, the Cryptoporticus may also have been used as a refuge during times of unrest. This semi-subterranean passageway has 3 U-shaped parallel tunnels and forms a vast substructure, nearly 300 feet long by 200 feet wide and about 15 feet high. As the Roman Empire declined, the Forum and its Cryptoporticus fell into disuse. Over the centuries since, the structure became buried underneath newer layers of construction. It wasn't until the 19th century that this area was rediscovered and excavated. San Trophime Church is a masterpiece of Romanesque architecture and dates back to the 12th century. It was built on the site of an earlier church and dedicated to Saint Trophimus, the first bishop of Arles. The best guess I've seen is that this was the site of an earlier Christian church, which in turn had been built on the site of what was once a Roman temple, probably dedicated to Emperor Augustus. With the arrival and legalization of Christianity, Roman temples were often repurposed into churches. What we see today, of course, comes much later. This Google Earth image gives you an idea of the general layout of the area. One of the most famous elements of the church is a dedicated portal on the western facade facing the square. The tympanum, the area over the door, features an image of Christ in majesty, surrounded by symbols of the 4 evangelists. Arles was one of the starting points of the Via Tolousana, a major route of the Camino de Santiago, leading to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Pilgrims stopped here for prayer and spiritual preparation, but also to rest. The attached cloister was the home of Augustinian canons and provided hospitality to those pilgrims, giving them a place to stop safely along their journey. Arles was an important religious center, and San Trophime hosted significant events, including the coronation of Emperor Frederick Barbarossa in 1178. We know that Romans put a very high priority on adequate supplies of fresh drinking water. A few minutes east of Arles, you can get an idea of the resourcefulness that allowed Roman cities like Arles to develop. They brought in water from an aqueduct. That in itself isn't unusual, but the water here did double duty. It not only watered the city, it provided power to run a series of grain mills. The Gaul aqueduct and its mills were constructed between the 1st century BCE through the early 1st century CE, during the height of Roman engineering activity. The structure is mostly in ruins, so you really have to use your imagination to visualize it. The route between the source and the destination included a very steep drop. Instead of bridging the gap, the Romans decided to put in a series of flour mills where the water could power water wheels, shown in this line drawing taken from Wikipedia. In addition to channeling the water downhill, the primary function of the mills was to grind grain into flour. This was an important industrial activity in the Roman Empire, especially for a city like Arles, which was growing and needed a steady supply of. The complex was apparently capable of milling 4.5 tons of flour daily, and that would produce enough bread for between 10 to 12,000 people a day, perhaps 1/3 of the city's maximum population. After that, the water continued to flow all the way to Arles, supplying the fountains, baths, and more in the city. Vincent van Gogh was an enormously talented, complicated, brilliant, and difficult man. He was always short of money. He only sold a few paintings in his lifetime and was supported by his younger brother Theo. He was ill, drank too much, and engaged in ferocious arguments with people thought to be his friends, almost certainly the result of some kind of mental illness, although there are numerous theories about what it might have been. A year or so after Vincent arrived in Arles, he sliced off part of his left ear and sent it, wrapped in a white napkin, reportedly to a local brothel. Earlier that evening, Vincent had a heated argument with Paul Gauguin, a fellow artist, and his housemate. The argument escalated and Gauguin left, possibly signaling that he was going to abandon their artistic collaboration. Van Gogh had been trying to establish an artist colony here in the city at the Yellow House, and he was devastated. That night, he sliced off part of his ear. The next day, he was found and hospitalized. The doctors diagnosed something called acute mania with generalized delirium. He was in and out of the hospital for weeks, suffering from episodes of psychosis. The incident alarmed the people of Arles, eventually leading to a petition demanding that he be removed from the town. A few months later, in May of 1889, he voluntarily moved to Saint-Rémy and admitted himself to Saint-Paul-de-Moselle Asylum. Vincent was, however, essentially chased out of town. The reaction today is quite different. Arles, which once came close to riding the man out of town on a rail, now embraces his legacy. They've even created a walking tour shown on this map. The story of Vincent, his life here in Arles, in Saint-Rémy, his partial recovery while incarcerated in a mental institution, and his eventual death are far too complicated for me to include in this video blog. My visit to Arles was rather spoiled by the cloudy weather, which gradually turned into an absolute downpour. You may be wondering how to pick a restaurant in a strange city during an off hour in a downpour when you don't have an internet connection to get ratings advice. In those days, I still took daytime insulin, which meant I rather had to eat on a schedule. Eating on a schedule and eating just any old thing don't have to be the same. I've found that when in doubt, Asian generally works best. It's usually safe because it's cooked to order. By the time I was ready for lunch, it was still pretty early, and it was raining very hard and quite miserable. None of the nearby cafes in the arena area were open. The cook saw me staring, sadly, at the menu in the window and opened up to accommodate me. After this lunch, I strolled the town for a bit longer, but the rain was continuing, so I called it a day and headed for the train station. And so are we. Come back next time for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Thank you for traveling with me today. This year, we'll be making a grand tour of France, not just the famous cities, although we'll hit them too, but some lesser known gems. The basis of all my French posts is my personal on-the-ground visits, extending over a period of more than half a century. I took a lot of pictures, I asked a lot of questions, and I tried to write down the answers. Things change, even in a puny human lifetime, and most French cities are considerably older than I am, so a great deal of research goes into each one of these presentations. Most of that work never makes it into the videos except as an incidental reference or a mention. You might wonder what happens to the rest of it. Well, I write it down, and sometimes, if it seems interesting enough, and I admit that is a matter of taste, I write it up and post it separately. If you want to know more, check the description box below. I'll put in links from time to time for more information. Sometimes this will be information I dug up, other times it'll be links to what I hope are honest, reputable sources. In addition, I have a travel blog, a health and wellness blog, because travel is easier if we're healthy, and can be found on Blue Sky and Facebook. The addresses are all to the side of this video. Finally, I have a favor to ask. If you enjoyed my post, please like, subscribe, and share. This will help my channel grow. Thank you, and keep on traveling.